last week, in Photoshop, you know that we went through, so anybody that wasn't here last week, just pay attention. Have a look up on the screen if you weren't here last week. So last week we were using the change colour tool, not that one, this one, and we were going through and we were looking up and downloading swatches from Adobe Colour, and then we were eyedropping those colours, and as soon as we eyedropper the colour from that swatch, we get that as the foreground colour, and then we're able to use that and the change colour tool to literally paint the new colour on so that it reflects. This was a triadic colour scheme, and so as soon as that's a different colour, so we've got the bear, so obviously you do a beautiful job of blending it, so something like that, and then you can turn those off and just make sure you're saving each one of them as a separate file. So we've got save bear triadic, so we know what that is. And once we're at that point, we're ready to bring it into Illustrator. So first off, you need to go through and make sure you've got all those different colour schemes, the triadic, monochromatic. This one I think is complementary opposite because it's got the green and the red. So make sure you've done all those. I've got them on the same file, but it's probably easier if you make sure you're saving separate files, because you want to bring in your favourite ones into Illustrator, and we're going to learn some new skills. So if you can step through with me in Illustrator, so open Illustrator, and you're going to go, so even if you're not up to this stage, just watch and start doing it. You can always go back to Photoshop to do the other things. So in Illustrator, you're going to make a new document. It's a print document. It's landscape. Measure in millimetres is always better. Work in RGB colour. You normally want to work in RGB colour until you're ready to send something to print, and then you can convert it to CMYK. But sometimes what we do is use things for screen as well as for print. So we want to have the biggest range of colours possible, which is what RGB gives us. So when we're being creative, both in Photoshop and Illustrator, you can work in RGB mode and then later on convert a copy usually, so you keep your original colours, to CMYK. So 300 ppi, that's your typical print document. Think about what we're doing. It should be a landscape, A3. So hit A3 landscape, switch it to landscape here, measure in millimetres, and then change it to RGB. So that's what you got, and then just create a single document. So it looks like that. And then we're going to go and find our little graphic. So I'm looking for my triadic bear, and I'm going to place it in there. Okay, so it looks like that, and I can scale it by holding down the Shift key, because we're going to make some repeat patterns with it. But very specifically, the first thing we're going to do, and we'll save this, is the first exercise, which is learn to use the reflect tool. So you're going to create a pattern using a combination, well, at least one that shows me that you can use the reflect tool. So I'll step through it. You go and find the reflect and rotate is sitting in the same little bucket of tools. So reflect is this one, that one's rotate. So switch to reflect. And to set the reflection point, so how's this tool going to behave, you need to hold down the Option key and click once. When you do that, you'll see it's flipped it around a vertical axis, and you want to hit copy. So that's one way of making a duplicate, but you can see it's flipped opposite. So the reflect tool is incredibly useful, because when you're drawing something, you can just, if it's a symmetrical object, you can draw half of it, flip the other side, join them together. So it's a really important one to know, not just for this project, which is why I'm insisting that you make a pattern using this first and then move on to some of the other. There are some very specific tools I'll show you, pattern making tools, commercial pattern making, we'll get to that. So I'm going to drag over those two, and that will group them, Command G to group them, or if you don't know the shortcuts, group and ungroup are under the object menu. Because they're grouped, I can now hold down the Shift key and scale them to whatever I want. And then I can do another reflect. This time I'm going to hover here and hold down the Option key. And this time I want to do a horizontal flip and again hit copy. Now I've got a nice little foursome sitting there. No, they're okay. And I'm going to shrink them down to whatever I, think. Yep. Something, you could go as small as you want, but maybe I want to, this one's children's wrapping paper. I still want my bears to be recognisable. And I could flip this whole thing again, holding down the Option key again, and this time vertical and copy. So they're kind of going opposite ways. So now I've got and I could move this over, maybe I want it a bit closer. So now I've got something that looks interesting. It's a little set that I've created before I start repeating. A really fast, easy way to copy and repeat is, again, I can drag over these, I can group them, I've got my first set, and I can do a very simple Option copy. So you could do edit, copy, and then edit, paste, but a more organic way to learn to do this is to hold down the Option key again and just drag, but hold down the Shift key as well, and then just do Command D. Command D is a magical command that lets you repeat whatever the last action was. So I'm going to zoom out a bit so you can see what it's done. So at this point I might decide I want to group all those, hold down the Shift key and just fit them in there. And now I could do another, if I want them to flip I could do that, but actually all I want to do is make rows. So if I hold down the Shift key, they're going to stay straight. If I don't hold down the Shift key, I could just offset them. That could be interesting. But if I just hold down the Shift key and then Command D, that's the Apple key, and D, just repeats the last thing you did. And hey presto, we've got our first pattern. So I want you to do one of those. I'll just come around and now at this point I could just manually repeat the first couple of rows or something like that if I wanted to. So I could just start sort of fiddling around with filling the sheet. Again, hold down the Shift key as well as the Option key if you want to keep things in line. So you could do something like that, and you could also put something in the gaps. So you could, if you've got extra little things, you can start putting things in the gap. Anything extra that I don't want, I could just, get rid of these ones that are off the edge. If it's grouped, I might have to go and ungroup, which is just Shift Apple G, and then I could just delete these ones if I don't want them. So that's sort of what we're going to do first off. We're going to, make a pattern that we're happy with, just using the reflect tool. So that's your first pattern. Before you finish that though, just make sure you've got the layers palette up. So window, layers, and I will just drag that over. So you can see at the moment I've got everything on the background layer. That's not ideal for what we're doing. So if I drag over this whole group of objects, you can see a little dot that appears there. That dot just refers to whatever you've got selected. So what I can do is make a new layer, and I'm going to put it underneath, and I'm going to call that background. So this is also a good thing to learn, is that you can shift things up and down layers, and you can see that each layer is color coded. So I want, my pattern on the top layer and nothing on the background because I'm going to put a colour on the background. So I can just turn off my pattern layer for a minute and I can go and fetch a colour again I could place my little colour swatches in here if I want to make sure I've got exactly the same colour. Or you can just randomly, this is your design now, you can start choosing a colour and just experimenting with a background colour. So if I put an object on, just a square across the whole thing, and then switch my top layer on, you can see that now I can switch the background colour very easily. I can experiment. Because I've got the background object selected, I can very quickly create a number of different variations till I've got one I'm pretty happy with, bearing in mind the audience, so thinking again about the sort of colours we thought was suitable. So if I think this is for a children's birthday party, if I do red, it looks more like Christmas paper. Yep, so I'm looking for something a little bit more happy, so probably a bit more pastel-y. If I think it's a 5-year-old birthday party with cute bears on it. If I want to go younger age group, I might go really soft and say maybe this is for a baby shower now. Yes, so it depends what you said were suitable colours, but by having the two things separated, so you have a background and you have the pattern on the top layer, and just remember that the little dot there refers to whatever you've got selected. And you can push and pull objects up and down layers just by using that little dot. Whatever you've got selected will pop up the different layer. So that's also a very useful idea to understand for Adobe Illustrator. So I'll just stop the recording there and go around, just make sure everybody's done that. And then we'll move on to the rotate tool, because the rotate tool is also really important when you're designing things. Now, at this point, there's nothing to stop you. If I wanted to have, right when I was designing my pattern, my first sort of set of objects, I could have brought in another object. So if you have some other object that you want to bring in, because several of you have got lots of little icons, then there's nothing to stop you from going back and placing some other graphic. But I would do that, get your sort of pattern arranged before you start doing the repeat pattern. So there's nothing to stop you from having multiple objects in there. You can see how difficult that is to work with because it's on the wrong layer. So I could make a new layer for that other object. Oh, and this is something to be aware of. If you drop down that arrow, you'll see all these sub-layers and you'll get very confused. So make sure you're working with whole layers. So that's referring to that little creature. I want to bring that up a layer. You can see only that creature has moved up because that was the only icon I had. That was the only thing I had selected, sorry. So before I began repeating it, I could have brought something else into. But do that if you want to arrange a few different objects. Do that so you've got a core set of objects you're going to repeat. And just try to stay out of the sub-layers. The sub-layers are great if you lose an object. It's going to be in there for you to select. So you can see everything I've done, every single step that I did in Illustrator, everything you draw will end up in one of these sub-layers. So if you lose an object, you can go down there and again, you can select it and you can move it up to a main layer. But most of the time we want to be working with these main layers and only going in there if we've lost an object and need to go find it again. Okay, so try to keep it fairly simple. The layers are color coded, so you can see that anything that's on that layer, when I click on it to select it, it comes up as blue. Anything like the background object is going to, if I select the background, you can see the edges are there and it turns up color coded as red. So that's a really helpful thing for you to understand when you're going to select things if something's on the wrong layer. Okay, so everybody have a go at creating your first pattern, and then make sure you save that. So into your document you'll be putting a number of patterns. So just save as pattern 1. Let's say pattern 1, reflect tool. So that's your first experiment, yeah? You're going to be doing multiple ones this morning. All right.